Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Thank you for joining us this evening to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it's my great honor to begin this evening's program by introducing Dr. Christine Mangino, President of QCC.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. My name is Dr. Christine Mangino, President of Queensborough Community College, and I'm honored that you've joined us this evening to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day, featuring our keynote speaker, Dr. Wolf Gruner. Today marks the 81st anniversary of the liberation of one of the most notorious death sites during the Holocaust, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Today, we commemorate the Nazis' mass murder of 6 million Jewish people, as well as the millions of other victims of Nazi persecution. The work of the KHC is to help students not only learn about what happened during the Holocaust, but to also critically reflect on how and why this history remains crucially relevant in our society today. Now more than ever, we want to inspire students, educators, and community members to find ways to stand up for one another during these especially destabilizing times. Queensborough's commitment to Holocaust education has never been more important. Around the world and here at home, we are witnessing a rise in anti-Semitism, hate, and violence that is eroding the very fabric of our shared society during a time when our neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, grocery stores, restaurants, and even our homes are no longer safe. In moments like these, remembrance becomes not only an act of mourning, but a call to moral clarity, compassion, and courage. We are deeply grateful for the support of our local elected officials, including Queensborough President Donovan Richards, Queens District Attorney Melinda Katz, and New York State Assemblywoman Nili Rozek, all of whom have sent messages of solidarity and support. Thank you, and may tonight's program strengthen our shared resolve to remember, to educate, and to act.
Good evening. I'm Queensborough President Donovan Richards Jr. It is an honor to welcome you to tonight's virtual International Holocaust Remembrance Day event, hosted by the Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College. Tonight, we come together to mourn the 6 million Jews and millions of others who were senselessly murdered by the Nazi regime and its allies. We hold this commemoration on the date of the 81st anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz death camp in Nazi-occupied Poland. This is an important date because only once Auschwitz was liberated did the immense scope of the Holocaust become clear to the whole world. And in response to that horror, the world has collectively pledged to never let such atrocities happen again. That begs the question of what we can do to help fulfill that pledge. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center has long been trying to find answers to this question. And as part of its continuing mission, the center has convened tonight's presentation on what ordinary Jews in Germany and annexed Austria did to resist Nazi persecution. Between 1933 and 1945, hundreds of Jews braved the threat of imprisonment, torture, and execution to document and publicly protest against Nazi atrocities. The fact that so many Jews of all ages and backgrounds engage in such resistance obliterates the common view of Jewish passivity under Nazi rule. It also should inspire us here in America to not be afraid to protest against the many unjust and cruel actions and policies of the current administration in Washington, D.C. Americans of all faiths, nationalities, and political persuasions have the obligation to be active participants in our democracy. And that means being willing to speak out against injustice wherever and whenever it occurs, no matter who is committing it. Because we all share one common humanity. And that means all of us, including our leaders at the highest levels of government, have the obligation to treat people with kindness and respect. It also means we can never allow hatred among individuals and groups to fester. So I thank the Kupferberg Holocaust Center for convening tonight's presentation. I'm proud Queens is home to such a worldwide leader in the study of the Holocaust and its legacy. And I hope tonight's event leads to further advances in our understanding of how we can effectively oppose injustice in all its forms. It is events like these that bring us closer to a more just and peaceful world. Thank you so much.
Today on Holocaust Remembrance Day, I thank the leadership of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College for their tireless efforts and work in remembering and standing in solidarity with Holocaust victims and survivors. On January 27, 1945, the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp was liberated, revealing to the world the full horror and atrocities committed there. Today, on this 81st anniversary, we come together to honor the innocent lives systematically murdered by the Nazi regime and its collaborators, driven by anti-Semitism, racism, and hatred. 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, as well as millions of other victims of the Nazi persecution, were brutally murdered during the Holocaust. This Remembrance Day, marked around the world, reminds us not only of the lives lost, but also of the imperative to educate, to remember, and to most importantly, to act. This call to action is especially urgent today as our communities face rising threats of hate and intolerance. Following October 7th, 2023, we saw a significant citywide rise in hate crimes, particularly targeting the Jewish communities. Fortunately, those numbers have decreased from their peak. According to the data, as of December 1st, 2025, citywide hate crimes were down 18% from the previous year, and hate crimes in Queens declined by 9%. Yet anti-Jewish hate crimes remain far too high, accounting for more than 55% of all hate crimes in the city of New York. From drawing swastikas on local synagogues to vandalizing public parks and memorials, each attack is a stain on the moral fiber of all of our communities. In response, my office recently partnered with the ADL of New York and New Jersey to host a first-of-its-kind all-day symposium for law enforcement focused on effectively combating anti-Jewish hate crimes. At the same time, my dedicated Hate Crimes Bureau continues to actively address hate-motivated offenses by prosecuting offenders, working with the community to prevent those crimes, and educating the public on how to report every incident. So as we pause today in memory of victims and survivors of the Holocaust, let us remember the precious lives lost and the lessons they leave us. That remembrance must always be paired with action. Let us act with courage that outshines hate, and let these actions be a legacy that is worthy of those memories of our lost loved ones. Zechronim Lebracha. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Assemblywoman Neely Rosick, sending you my best wishes as you gather today to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. As you can see, I'm not there in person with you. I'm actually still in Albany, where we this morning also passed our annual resolution recognizing this important day in our history. A day that resonates tremendously, not just with my family, but with many across Queens. It's so important as the number of survivors dwindles that we continue to hold events like tonight's event and pass resolutions in the halls of power to remind folks that it wasn't too long ago that we had these atrocities occurring across the globe. Today, we also face a deepening anti-Semitism that has reared its ugly head again. We have a second set of survivors, and we really need to battle the constant misinformation that engulfs so many of our young generations. It's my mission here in Albany to continue that work, and I just want to say a big thank you to the Kupferberg Center for all the work that they do to educate students on the front lines every single day, so that we are remembering the atrocities of the Holocaust and also teaching the next generation the true meaning of never again. I hope that you'll take a moment after tonight's program, go on my website. You're able to watch today's resolution and a lot of the speeches that were made from colleagues across the state, standing shoulder to shoulder with us in this community in commemoration. I want to say to Dr. Cohen, thank you so much for all the work that you do leading the center and making sure that never again is not just a phrase, but it's something that we live every single day. So with that, again, I just want to send my warm thoughts. This is Assemblywoman Neely Rosick. Thank you.
My sincerest thanks to President Mangino, Queensborough President Richards, Queens District Attorney Katz, and New York State Assemblywoman Rosick. Our event this evening is underwritten by the Ava Bobrow Memorial Fund and is co-sponsored by 9 organizations around the country. They include the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, the Reif Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution at Christopher Newport University, the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Ray Walpaugh Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University, the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University, the Genocide Studies Program at Yale University, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Salem State University, and the Sam and Francis Freed Holocaust and Genocide Academy at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. After the presentation, we'll host a short Q&A, so please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Wolf Gruner. Dr. Gruner holds the Shapell-Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and is professor of history at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles since 2008. He's the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research since 2014. Dr. Gruner is a specialist in the history of the Holocaust, comparative genocide studies, and the global history of racism. He received his PhD in history from Technical University Berlin in 1994, as well as his habilitation in 2006. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Women's Christian University Tokyo, and the Center for Jewish Studies Berlin-Brandenburg, as well as the Desmond E. Lee Visiting Professor for Global Awareness at Webster University in St. Louis. Dr. Gruner is an appointed member of the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and a founding member of the Executive Committee of the Consortium of Higher Education Centers for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies. He's the author of 11 books on the Holocaust, among them Jewish Forced Labor Under the Nazis, Economic Needs and Nazi Racial Aims, and The Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia, Czech Initiatives, German Policies, and German Responses. He's also co-edited 5 books, including Resisting Persecution, Jews and Their Petitions During the Holocaust. His most recent book, Resisters, How Ordinary Jews Fought Persecution in Hitler's Germany, became a finalist for the Yad Vashem International Book Prize and the National Jewish Book Award, and is the subject of his talk this evening. Dr. Gruner, thank you for being with us tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can see and hear me. I really want to express my gratitude to Laura Cohen for the invitation to give this talk, especially today, but also for her important work at the Kupferberg Center at Queensborough Community College. So what I want to do in this talk is first to present you one of the main stories of the book. And then I want to explain a little bit why we didn't really recognize these kind of stories of individual resistance in our, let's say, previous understanding of how persecution happened and how Jews responded to it. And then in the remaining part of my talk, I will give you a brief survey about different types of individual resistance, which I kind of wrote up, and also share some stories. So let me bring you back to the year 1940. This is the second year of the World War. The city is Frankfurt am Main in Western Germany. And every night, Hans Oppenheimer, a 17-year-old boy, is leaving his house, despite that there is a curfew for Jews, which prohibits them to actually leave the houses after 8 p.m. When he leaves the house, he is anxiously waiting to hear the sound of the Allied bombers circling around the city. When the first kind of bombs fell, he is rushing to the next fire alarm post and sets off a fire alarm. However, there is no kind of burning house inside. He sets deliberately wrong fire alarms to divert the firefighters, the trucks, from the actual burning houses. So how did he come to the kind of decision to set off these wrong fire alarms in the second year of the World War after so many years of persecution? He was the firstborn son of a merchant family in Frankfurt. His father sold accessories to tailors in Frankfurt. The family lived a good life. They had a great apartment on an imposing boulevard in Frankfurt East End, where a lot of well-off Jewish families lived. And in 1933, he graduated from elementary school. Because of the changing circumstances in Germany, the parents decided to take him off a public school and enroll him into a private Jewish school, which was a very famous school in Germany, the Philanthropin in Frankfurt, which the Rothschild family had founded in the 19th century. Despite the increasing persecution since 1933, which affected almost every Jewish family, this private school was able to shield a little bit the Jewish pupils from this increasingly hostile environment. After Hans graduated from middle school with good grades in 1937, he started an apprenticeship, and this for two reasons. So he did not go to high school. The first reason was that he wanted to learn a kind of a manual craft to get a job immediately to sustain his family, because his father had already lost his business and the family depended now on public welfare. The second reason was kind of more long-term. He wanted to acquire skills which would enable him to leave Germany. And this was for the obvious reason that since 1933, anti-Jewish laws and especially local municipal policies had made life for the Jewish community unbearable in Frankfurt. In Frankfurt housed the second largest Jewish community in Germany. Already in 1933, the new Nazi mayor had cut ties to Jewish businesses. He dismissed Jewish employees from the municipality. In 1936, they reduced welfare benefits for poor Jewish families. And they were also forerunners in other anti-Jewish local policies like the expropriation of real estate and art collections. So the vocational school, which Hans started his apprenticeship in 1937, had just been founded a year earlier in an abandoned factory. And they trained Jewish teenagers as blacksmiths, gardeners, so that they had skills which they could use to emigrate. After Hans finished his apprenticeship in spring of 1939, so that means a few months after Kristallnacht, he registered at the Frankfurt Labor Office in order to find work. However, the Frankfurt Labor Office sent this now 16-year-old Hans Oppenheimer to a labor camp for Jews almost 70 miles away from Frankfurt. The camp was part of a newly established forced labor program for Jews. It had just been introduced after Kristallnacht in order to exploit Jews who were receiving unemployment benefits or were looking for work. During summer 1939, already 20,000 Jewish men, young and old, toiled as forced laborers, for example, at road constructions, as kind of removing garbage and cleaning streets. After 1 year in this camp, the Frankfurt Labor Office put him on a train to another forced labor camp in a small town called Kelkheim in Taunus. Hans would not see his family for months because Jewish forced laborers didn't get vacations. Moreover, the environment in Kelkheim was even more hostile than in the previous forced labor camp. The mayor was extremely anti-Semitic. He segregated the Jewish forced labor from the town population. He ordered frequent beatings to enhance productivity. And the conditions were so horrible that one of the forced laborers committed suicide. So I think you now get a sense that these personal experiences of forced labor, discrimination, kind of drove Hans Oppenheimer to the decision to do something against the Nazis. So when he returned in November 1940 from this forced labor camp, he started to set off these false fire alarms. In some cases, he even pulled the alarm twice after the fire trucks had already left the premises because they hadn't found anything. Unfortunately, Hans, because of precaution, because there were kind of police patrols looking, for example, for Jews who would not adhere to the curfew, he only used 3 fire alarm posts near to his house. So the police set a trap, and on December 10th, 1940, he was caught red-handed in the moment when he wanted to push the fire alarm button. He then was put in pre-trial detention, and in April 1941, the main prosecutor in Frankfurt charged him with several felonies according to the criminal code, as well as for offenses under a new war decree, the so-called public vermin decree. The written indictment emphasized that Hans Oppenheimer was a full Jew, and the prosecutor pointed out that the Gestapo had assessed after interrogation that Hans was an unstable, lazy, and dishonest human being who was eager to destroy things. Under the interrogation by the Gestapo, Hans had only admitted to 9 false fire alarms. However, the Frankfurt prosecutor suspected that Hans was actually responsible for far more crimes because in his neighborhood, 44 false fire alarms had been reported during the fall, a series that had ended with his arrest. The indictment mentioned that the German People's Court was not able to prove military treason, which would have resulted in the death penalty. Hence, now the prosecutor proposed a sentence of 6 years in penitentiary. And he argued that the punishment must be particularly harsh for a Jew who had acted as an enemy during the war of the German people. In May 1941, he was charged with 9 cases of malicious acts and then was put on trial. He had to defend himself. There was no defense lawyer. And Hans just turned 18 a few months before. After a short trial, the special court punished Hans with 3 years in prison for being a so-called public vermin, sabotaging the war effort. Fortunately, the judge did not follow the prosecution's request to apply adult law. However, the judge emphasized in his verdict that as a Jew, Hans had to pay special attention to the law, since he was only tolerated as a guest in Germany. In June 1941, he was transferred to a small prison in a small town, Diez an der Lahn. From the first day on, Hans was put in solitary confinement, and he had to work folding bags. The isolation and the overall conditions took a rapid toll on him. His only lifeline were monthly letters to his family, where he begged his parents to visit him. and he needed medication for kind of emerging illnesses like skin rashes and painful teeth cavities. He did not know that many of his messages ended up being shelved in the prison file, censored by the warden for his too outspoken critique on the miserable prison conditions. His deteriorating health and the isolation exhausted him physically and emotionally. But he still did not back down. He frequently petitioned the prison warden, protesting against the maltreatment of Jews and the prison conditions. When the parents asked him to change his behavior because they heard about it, Hans responded that this was not his fault alone. In one of the confiscated letters, Hans wrote at the end that thinking about his life would make him crazy. And he told his parents in the letter, and I quote, "You know best that I never had the chance to visit a cinema, a theater, or a cabaret." He was so depressed that he tried to commit twice suicide, but guards kind of saved his life twice. But then at the end of 1942, after 1.5 years in prison, there was an agreement between the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, and the Reich Ministry of Justice that all Jewish prisoners from prisons inside the Reich had to be moved and transferred to concentration camps. And this is why Hans Oppenheimer was then, at the end of 1940, transported to Auschwitz. Because of his weakened state, he did not survive for long in Auschwitz. His death was recorded on January 30th, 1943, only days after he had turned 20 years old. So what does the story of Hans Oppenheimer reveal about individual responses of Jews toward the Nazi persecution? During the Third Reich, there are a lot of kind of administrative complaints by Nazis about the so-called impudent attitude of Jews. For example, in March 1935, the Gestapo in Aachen reported, and I quote, "The number of Jews who had sent letters and protested in person had become quite numerous, and in their tone often impudent," end of quote. Still during the war, in April 1940, the Reich main security of the SS emphasized that it had received information from all corners of the Reich about the impudent attitude of Jews. Historians like myself, we always thought the frequent mentioning of impudent Jews would just serve as a pretext for the Nazis to introduce more radical laws. Yet this was not just rhetoric. In their July 1935 report for Berlin, the Gestapo emphasized that Jews were born with disrespect for state authority. And during this very month, the Gestapo actually arrested more than 100 Jewish men and women for offenses against the Nazi state or the Nazi party. So you see, there was some truth to kind of what they call disrespect for state authority. And this didn't change until the war or during the war. In fall 1942, so the same time when Hans Oppenheimer was in prison, around 1,200 Jewish men and women were served sentences for so-called political offenses in prisons across the German Reich. This was 2% of the remaining Jewish population. If we would kind of translate this to the current US population of 330 million, this would mean over 6 million people would be in jail for resistance. Hence, these frequent complaints about the so-called impudent Jew point to a forgotten reality of widespread acts of individual resistance. During the last decade, my systematic research revealed that hundreds of Jewish men and women did resist. And I think this needs kind of to produce a reassessment of Jewish reactions towards Nazi persecution. My research results strongly challenge the ideas that Jews in general, but specifically also in Nazi Germany, did not resist the terrors of the Third Reich. And I think there were two reasons why there was this idea of Jewish passivity. One was a very narrow conceptual approach, and the other was kind of a very limited source base. Let me briefly talk about the conceptual approach. So, since 1945, historians have discussed Jewish resistance. This started very early on, and over the decades, there was always discussion. However, they always kind of discussed this only in terms of organized and group resistance, and also specifically about armed resistance. Israeli scholars had kind of challenged this from the very beginning, right after 1945, but most scholars in the end settled that organized and armed resistance was the actual resistance, and that it mainly occurred in the eastern occupied territories. Hence, there was never a systematic evaluation of individual Jewish resistance. And even in those kind of accounts about the Holocaust, which focus on, let's say, Jewish voices, for example, the widely acclaimed works of Saul Friedlander, they never really kind of unearthed this type of individual resistance. What I did in my book is I actually revived existing approaches. So this is nothing unique what I did, because already in the 1950s, the Israeli survivor Meir Dvoretsky, and then later in the 1970s, Konrad Kviet, an Australian historian, and an East German historian, Helmut Eschwege, they all tried to include individual acts of resistance into our understanding what resistance was. And this allowed to include, for example, attitudes like nonconformity, defiance, protest. The same elements were also discussed in general kind of discussions about resistance against the Nazis in the 1980s. And somehow they also resonate with ideas which were discussed by the anthropologist James Scott, or, for example, scholars working on US slavery. So what I did in my work is I tried to change the definition of resistance. And now I have to pull up my PowerPoint. Yes, and here's the definition. So what I did was very simple. I just added the term individual to this very widely used definition by Yehuda Bauer. And I think this immediately kind of changes our perspective and allows to include disobeying laws or protests into our understanding of resistance. And just to think about this kind of as a new lens, we can see this even in photographs. So, for example, this photograph here is widely used as illustrating the first terror weeks in 1933, and you see here Michael Siegel in the center of the picture. He is dragged by stormtroopers through the city center of Munich. However, it is not just about random terror here, because if you look closer, he has a sign around his neck saying, "I won't complain at the police anymore." And so he tried to release a client of his, he was a lawyer, and because of this act of defiance, the stormtroopers kind of cut his pants off and dragged him through the cities. Or this picture. I used this in my classes at USC to illustrate the local initiatives like to prohibit Jews to enter the swimming pool, the public pool. But then look at this picture, how Dora Franken is actually standing there, very defiant. So she has a defiant posture and let somebody take a picture. Or this picture of the Marx family, which is taken on the day after Nazis painted this notorious anti-Jewish slogan at the wall of their house. Or my favorite picture, which is on the cover of the book, is this is Lizzie Rosenfeld, a young Jewish woman in Vienna, who is sitting on a bench. And for those who don't read German, it says only for Aryans. So it was prohibited for Jews to sit there. And she commits 3 offenses because she sits there. Then she lets somebody take a photograph to document this act of resistance, and then later she smuggles this negative out of Germany. Or during Kristallnacht, Jews took pictures about the devastation after attacks on their homes. And this is, by the way, the topic of my next book is the mass attacks on Jewish homes and the destruction in these homes. But just the act to document the crimes of the Nazis during Kristallnacht was in itself an act of resistance. So one part is to rethink the definition of resistance by including individual resistance. The next part is to broaden the source base. So previously, historians have used mostly sources like Gestapo reports, SS reports, so administrative sources, or ego documents like diaries and letters. But in both types of sources, the individual acts of resistance I will talk about are not really surfacing. So what I did was that I went to local archives looking into police records, police logbooks, court records, but then I added also 170 interviews from the USC Shoah Foundation to my source base. And this, in a way, changed dramatically what I thought about individual resistance. So I found so many cases that I had to, in a way, to bring some order into this mountain of material. And I came up with these 5 different types of individual Jewish resistance: challenging anti-Jewish propaganda, verbal protest, written protest, disobeying anti-Jewish regulations, and then the last one is physical self-defense. So let me share some stories for each type of resistance with you. So when we think about challenging anti-Jewish propaganda, from the very beginning in 1933, Jews were arrested and punished for example, for besmearing displays of anti-Semitic newspapers, for tearing down Nazi flags, for destroying anti-Jewish propaganda posters. And the main story in my book is about David Bornstein. He was a merchant in Hamburg, and one summer day in 1936, he accompanied his wife to the bus terminal at the outskirts of the town, and they both waited for the bus to depart. She was sitting inside, and he was standing outside. During waiting and chatting with his wife through the window, he tried to destroy the swastika logo on the public bus. And this is a Gestapo photo, as you can see. And here's a photo which is kind of a historical reenactment of this individual act of resistance. You see here in the window the Gestapo officer impersonating his wife. And then you see the bus conductor who actually denounced the act of resistance to impersonate David Bornstein, how he used his walking stick, his cane, to destroy the swastika logo on this bus. He got arrested, and then a special court punished David Bornstein with 5 weeks in jail for this act of resistance. After he got out of jail, later he fled Germany with his wife and his little daughter. And we can see from the sources that this type of resistance, like challenging the Nazi propaganda, did not stop even during the war. There are arrests also for tearing down anti-Jewish posters and also Nazi flags. oral protest. This is the bulk of my kind of material. It was so widespread that there's really a mountain of material here. Already in March and April 1933, Jews got arrested because they critiqued the first wave of terror, and specifically the beatings and murder of Jews in various cities in Germany. Throughout the time, throughout the next years, Jewish men and women were arrested and tried for speaking up against specific anti-Jewish regulations, laws like the Nuremberg laws, or also violent events or violent attacks. So, for example, during the November pogrom of 1938, Kristallnacht. Here, the main story is about Henriette Schäfer, a woman who left her house the morning after the violent attacks during Kristallnacht and went to a nearby store. In the store, she asked the shop owner, and I quote, "What do you think about the fact that everything is being destroyed? The synagogues are arsoned." End of quote. The owner of the shop responded along the official party lines, "Oh yes, this is not this is kind of the outrage of the people about the murder of our diplomat in Paris." Schäfer replied, quote, "No, no, no, this is not the people, but the government. They are all blackguards, scums, and criminals. Hitler is the biggest bandit. If I could, I would poison them all." End of quote. She received 6 months in prison for this comment. And the Nazis used this law, the law against treacherous attacks, to quell this type of protest by Jews. We thought always it was mostly directed against communists and social democrats, but practically in all special court records, which I investigated, you find dozens of trials against Jews using this law when they spoke up. So even during the war, this did not stop Jews for speaking out and protesting. So, for example, Hertha Reis, she was 36 years old. She was a forced laborer in Berlin. And in 1941, she was evicted from her home with her mother and her son. Leaving the courthouse in Berlin in plain daylight, she exclaimed in front of passers-by, and I quote, "We lost everything. Because of the damned government, we finally lost our home too. This thug Hitler, the damned government, the damned people. Just because we are Jews, we are discriminated against." End of quote. While we don't know exactly what happened to her later, we know about the fate of Gabriele Reich. She was sentenced to 10 months in prison for similar comments in public. She had criticized anti-Jewish measures in Vienna. She had insulted Hitler in public. And on top of this, she had also listened to forbidden foreign broadcasts. The third category is written protest. And here we have a great variety of what type of protest we are looking at. Since 1933, many Jews intervened against the persecution or the discrimination by writing petitions. Almost every archive has hundreds of them. We almost mostly discarded them as the Jews wrote them in vain. They had no effect at all. But when you look closer at them, you actually see that in many of these petitions, Jews not just critiqued measures of the government, but also the kind of classification of the Jews as non-Germans, that they tried to recapture, so to speak, their citizenship, and also to kind of recapture that they were not only citizens of Germany, but also valuable contributors to German history and culture. So For example, in summer 1935, when there were anti-Jewish riots in Berlin by stormtroopers, Hitler Youth, and others, they defaced Jewish shops in Berlin. This provoked a kind of a whole series of petitions against these kind of attacks on Jewish property. However, at the same time that Jews wrote these petitions, and you have to imagine when they wrote petitions, while this was kind of an accepted political tool and the only one Jews had actually at their disposal, they still signed them with their names. So they put themselves out there. But then there were also anonymous protests. And during the same time of these riots, there were leaflets in Berlin discovered which said, and I quote, "Germany is a cultural disgrace today. I'm a German Jew and loyal to the emperor. In fact, the Germans should expel the foreigner Hitler. Down with Hitler!" Exclamation mark. End of quote. This is not the leaflet itself, it's just the police report about this leaflet. And even during the war, Jews would speak up and complain about the radicalized persecution with petitions, for example, against evictions from their homes in Vienna. But there was also more anonymous protest. And this is the main story of this chapter in the book. And this is the story of a 70-year-old man, Benno Neuburger. He was a former real estate broker in Munich. He had lost his children to immigration. They had moved to the United States. He and his wife could never witness the marriages of their children because they tried to get out but could not get out of Germany. And so when the war broke out and this practically finalized that they were that there was no chance to ever kind of emigrate and join their children, in the fall of 1941, when the Yellow Star was introduced, this was what kind of for Benno Neuburger broke the straw which broke the camel's neck. He was so outraged about the branding of the Jews with the Yellow Star that over the next months he put these post stamps on postcards, and then he wrote abusive comments above them or near them, like you see here. So on the left it says, "The eternal mass murderer Hitler, disgusting!" exclamation mark. And in the center it says, "Perish, bestie, murderer, bandit." And you see the last card on the right is the most prophetic one because it says murderer of 5 million. So here he already anticipates something which was not yet known and had not yet fully happened in Germany. So he did one mistake, unfortunately. He used one of his old real estate postcards from his old real estate firm, and this is how the Gestapo got a hold of him. And here's Benno Neuburger, and if you look closely, you can see that there is a bruise under his eye, which kind of in a way points that he was heavily interrogated and probably tortured. So he was put on trial in Berlin in front of the notorious People's Court for treason because of these comments on these postcards. And even there, he courageously stood up and claimed that he hated Hitler for the persecution of the Jews, and especially for his announcement that he wanted to kind of annihilate the European Jews. This announcement was from January 1939. So Benno Neuburger was sentenced to death by the Berlin People's Court, and he was beheaded in September 1942. So the fourth category is disobeying anti-Jewish laws. And here again, we have a huge variety of individual acts of resistance. Jews defied all kinds of local regulations, like visiting swimming pools and cinemas. You might have heard this from stories in memoirs and so on. But they also disobeyed anti-Jewish laws. So, for example, one law or one decree, which we never really thought of, was actually heavily challenged by Jews. And this was the decree about the forced adoption of the middle names Sarah and Israel. Here, interestingly, everybody thought the Nazis just obliged Jews to adopt these names. However, the German name law said you had to apply for name change yourself. You have to fill out a form, and then you had to pay 3 Reichsmark. And many archives contain traces that dozens and dozens of Jews never actually filled out these forms. They resisted, like Ida Schneider. She was 73-year-old living in Leipzig, and she was only discovered 2 years after this decree took place in 1941, that she had never applied for the name change, and that also she had never applied for the identification card, which was marked for Jews. Very similar, many Jews also resisted to wear the yellow star, or they covered this up. And this was not something, let's say, like an act cavalier, because the Nazis heavily punished this with several weeks or months in prison when somebody was detected without the yellow star. And then other restrictions like the curfew were kind of ignored, like Hans Oppenheimer did, or Max Mannheimer. He was a forced laborer, 20 years old. And I want to quote from his diary, because this is the only diary I found where somebody talks about individual resistance. And I quote, "My home is in a wooden hut behind the tool shed. From there I go to the public park. Despite the 8 p.m. curfew and despite the ban to visit the park. On my way I count the signs. In total there were 6. With the slogan, 'Forbidden for Jews.' Later at 11 p.m., I rip the signs out of the ground and throw them into the bushes and some into the creek. However, all my courage proved futile. The next evening, all the signs had re-emerged. For a second time, I did not have the courage. I'm just not a hero." End of quote. Even though he downplays in his diary what he did, then he broke the laws again the next evening by checking on if kind of what happened in the park. So I think we can disagree with his self-assessment here. So let me come to the last aspect, which is really the most surprising. And here, the archives in Germany didn't yield much material, but a lot more we can learn from the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation. They tell us that Jewish men got frequently into physical brawls with stormtroopers in the street, or with Nazi neighbors who discriminated against tenants. Jewish teenagers, boys and girls, responded to harassment, verbal and physical abuse by Hitler Youth, schoolmates, or neighborhood kids. And there were 30 testimonies of teenagers defending themselves, and interestingly, 1/3 of them were actually by testimonies of girls at the time, who defended themselves against other girls, but also against boys. The story in the book is the story of Daisy Gronowski. She was 16 years old, living in Berlin, but at the time of Kristallnacht, she was trained in an agricultural retraining camp, a Hachshara camp, to prepare for the emigration to Palestine. And this is what she experienced when she witnessed Kristallnacht.
The kids, the youngsters, and the boys, they were bleeding. And then all of a sudden I came my turn. I said, hell, I'm not going to run. I'm going to walk. Here I am. 5'0" I'm 5'1". 5'0", and I'm a skinny little girl. And all of a sudden it wasn't any fun anymore. And I remember one getting one on the back. And that was it. I just walked through very slowly looking at all of them. Now here, big tough guys. You want to hit a little girl. What can I do about it? You know, it's the attitude. And I only got hit by one on the back. It hurt. And I got to the end of the line. One of them grabs me, grabs this hand, my right hand, and starts sawing into it with a rusty knife. Pocket knife type thing. Well, I had learned a little trick. And that's sticking my head into someone's stomach, which doesn't feel great. And I turned around to see what I could do with him. And I started fighting. And I started kicking with my legs, his legs. He wasn't very big either, and he was young. Anyway, I finally managed to get my head out and under the knife. I twisted the knife out of his hand. I used the knife. I stabbed him, and I dug my head into his stomach. I don't know how I did it. It was just a fast thing that they had told me. And the others didn't notice it. So a couple of the guys, the others were too busy beating up on him. So a couple of the guys saw it, and they dragged him underneath a bed or some kind of a sofa type thing that hadn't been kicked over so the others wouldn't see him. He was bleeding. He wasn't dead, but he was bleeding. Anyway, that's when we took off.
So just to explain this a little bit, she was a member of Hashomer Hatzair, a young leftist Zionist youth group, and they had perceived self-defense training in jiu-jitsu back in Berlin. And this is the trick she is talking about that she kind of applied here. They ran away, they got caught, and then she escaped again and finally made it out to the Jewish community in Cologne. And from there, she went on a Kindertransport to England and survived. So let me come to the conclusion. Defining resistance as an individual or group action kind of changes our perspective. It brings to light an incredible number of individual courageous acts of defiance and protest. However, many more of these kind of acts are still unknown because too many archives are still left untouched, and many incidents also never left traces, which we know from the Shoah Foundation testimonies. So I shared with you that I kind of created these 5 categories: contesting Nazi propaganda, oral and written response, protest, defying anti-Jewish legislation, and physical self-defense. One important result of my research is that, interestingly, men and women, young and old, resisted equally on an individual basis. I could not find patterns of age, gender, beliefs, profession, or social status. Every Jewish man and woman developed their own kind of particular and over time also sometimes changing kind of responses toward the persecution. As the Berlin Rabbi Max Nussbaum recalled in the 1960s, and I quote, "We were besieged in 100 of different manners, and therefore we fought back we fought back in 100 of different manners." End of quote. Some might question if these small acts in this lecture, which I described in this lecture, deserve to be called resistance. However, I think it's not up to us, the scholars, or even the survivors, to kind of define what the individual resistance was, but actually the perpetrators themselves defined it. Because what they punished and perceived as a threat, that's what we can what we can actually name as individual resistance. So what I think we need to do in the future is to appreciate and commemorate these courageous efforts of so many Jews and change our standard Holocaust narrative and incorporate these types of stories. And when we do this, then this renders all their claims of the Jewish passivity obsolete once and for all. Thank you.
Wolf, this is really humbling to hear. And as I was going through the book, I was also really struck by this dichotomy of the way we've historically, as you talk about, think about Jewish resistance being organized, being in the woods, and not really thinking about what it looks like, especially in urban environments, especially from people who, I guess, don't fit the mold of what we think resistors would look like. And I think my first question to you is, you just talked about thinking and rethinking how we teach about the Holocaust. So when we're thinking about young people coming into Holocaust museums and Holocaust education centers, how do we incorporate this lens, especially when so much of the debate right now, we also have one of the big debates in the field is around, are we teaching just about Jewish death? Are we also talking about Jewish life and what happened before then?
Yeah, I think what these results actually enable us is to, in a way, to reduce the distance between, let's say, the people who want to learn about resistance and the so-called resistors. Because previously we thought about these as heroes, very rare kind of creatures who stood up. But if we think in a different way, like my research shows, it can be everybody, anybody. It is, so it's not, doesn't actually need special characteristics, special upbringing, special capabilities. Everybody can resist in one form or the other. And I think that's actually a really great lesson from this research.
Well, I'm also just the way you said that, and you were talking about, I was taking notes, even taking photos was an act of resistance. And there's a big debate going on in this country, and I'm saying it very nicely, around whether or not people have the right to take videos with their phones, documenting things, even from a distance or close up. So I wanted to ask, we've got a few questions that have come in through the chat. And one, there's sort of two parts around resistance. And one is, did the sanctions for resistance get more serious as the war years progressed? And was there any connection to the decisions made at Wannsee to regarding the final solution? And another aspect of this would be, was this kind of resistance more harshly or less harshly punished than resistance by non-Jewish people, and specifically the young folks in the White Rose movement?
Yeah, these are two very good questions. So on the one hand, I didn't see big differences between non-Jewish and Jewish resistance regarding their punishment. So they used, for example, when people protested, the same law, the law against treacherous attacks. And interestingly, I found many non-Jewish Germans protesting the persecution of the Jews, which we also never really thought about, that this actually happened. And they were punished in this with almost the same sentences as the Jews, because the law kind of prescribed a certain range of sentences, and that's what they applied. And this is interesting that the Nazi in Germany is, and we often think more about what happens in Poland, but in Germany itself, things were still a little bit differently, even during the war. The Nazis in Germany thought about themselves as a legal state. This was not an occupation or colonial regime in the East. This was proper Germany. So we follow the law, even if we create kind of discriminatory laws, but we follow them. And so this surprised me too, that even during the war in 1941, people were put on trial. Yeah, they were not even deported, they were put on trial. There are some tendencies, for example, in Vienna, where the Gestapo actually sometimes ignores that they should put them on trial because the law applied. But in general, it is actually really surprising that they were not that they were tried. However, even more surprising is that in 1941, judges actually released Jews, that they acquitted Jews. So when they could not establish the facts in the way they wanted, or if the witnesses were deemed not reliable, then Jews even got free from a trial. Yeah, so that's all very surprising. But I think the difference is here, this was Germany proper, and the conditions were very different than in Poland or in other occupied territories. And that's what I said is also the sentences don't get harsher. They depend very much on how they were, what laws applied. And I thought it was clear in the difference. Public protest it was several months till 2 years. But for example, what Benno Neuberger did with public kind of insulting Hitler, publicly insulting Hitler, this was perceived as treason, and he lost his life because of this.
And so just to clarify, these are actual real trials, like legitimate. They're not show trials at all.
I mean, I would say the trial in Berlin, the People's Court trial, they are more show trials. But in all the other trials, this was also fascinating to learn, because they happen in the majority of the public protest cases in so-called special courts. They were created by the Nazis in 1933 to punish political enemies. But even they followed some kind of legal procedures. And so even those special courts, while the prosecutors often were very anti-Semitic, the judges were often much more kind of, I would say, they followed the laws they applied. So.
And can you talk a little bit about any connection to Wannsee?
Oh, yeah. So the Wannsee Conference insofar has not, in Germany proper, not really an influence. I mean, even though in the East, the mass killings are already going on before Wannsee, the whole fall is with massacres all over Eastern Europe. The only thing what happens in Germany is deportations start, but and are organized in a more rapid pace. But for those who were tried, they were still put in prison until the moment which I try to illustrate with Hans Oppenheimer at the end of 1942. That's the moment. So this is almost a year after, a little bit less than a year after Wannsee. That's when then this agreement happened that Jews were taken out of prison and moved to Auschwitz.
It's really, I was going through that part again in the book, and just there's a statement when you write, Jews were constantly living under the oppressive thought of being deported, and the family sending Hans all his clothing, and then we find out sort of the horrific fates that ensue from his family. So here's another question, just to kind of bring it to where we are now. Another person has written in, what advice do you have for us today based on these insights and kind of going through the archive and surfacing these individual stories of resistance?
Yeah, I can only say no act is too small. So every act has some kind of effect. Sometimes the effect is not visible. So, for example, in many of the cases which I looked at for Jews in Nazi Germany, there are no visible kind of changes by the regime as a response. But in others, you can see some responses. So, for example, in Berlin, 1940, there were introduced limited shopping hours for Jews. So they were only allowed to buy groceries in the late afternoon hours when food was gone. They had often a hard time because they were in forced labor. So many Jews tried to disobey these rules by either going to doing other toil times or asking friends or neighbors to shop for them. So since many did this, the Nazis had to kind of issue more and more decrees about the same fact, that Jews need to kind of really pay attention to these limited shopping hours. So, and then they actually started to also threaten them with punishment, which was not in the first decree. So there is an effect visible. And in others, there's an indirect effect. So, for example, I talked about petitions, which we thought they were written in vain. Sometimes they can actually, first of all, they consume time of the perpetrators because institutions still looked at them. And sometimes they involved other institutions, which took up more time. And then sometimes this actually saved lives of Jews because this took sometimes a year or two. And this was, but when on the one hand, they could emigrate, or later in the war, they could survive because they were not deported for this. So there are these also sometimes invisible effects. And here I would say for today, when I started with the project and I gave talks, people often didn't really understand why these small acts matter. From my experience, since I grew up in a dictatorship in East Germany, I knew that it resonated very differently for me because I knew for what small things people got arrested. And I just want to remind people, maybe you have heard about this, when the invasion of the Ukraine happened, there was this incident on the Red Square in Moscow where a woman sat on the Red Square with a blank sheet of paper. And she was arrested for anti-war propaganda, although there was nothing on the page. So the perpetrators defined what they feel is threatening. And so that's why I think the smallest act is valuable.
Timothy Snyder, the historian, actually talks about that as well in this moment in our society where people are questioning a lot if that's happening and what can we do against what feels like some really oppressive policies that are taking place with real serious physical, emotional, and political harm. Being able to do the thing that you can do in your life, in your sphere, whatever that looks like, is really, really critical. A few more questions have come in. One guest writes, you talked about one person being sentenced for, amongst other things, listening to foreign broadcasts. To what extent do you consider educating yourself about the truth as its own form of resistance, as opposed to considering it disobeying the Nazi rules?
Oh, in this instance, it was actually disobeying two Nazi rules. One, the not listening or the prohibition to listen to foreign broadcasts, it was actually true for everybody. So not just for Jews. It was forbidden for everybody. So listening to BBC or Radio Moscow, this was kind of a big crime, and it was also really harshly punished, I have to say. People got a year or 2 years in prison for this. But then for Jews especially, it was actually also in a way challenging a second rule, which was the Nazis prohibited that Jews had access to information by various means. They took away phones. They didn't allow the publication of newspapers or the subscription to newspapers. So to get information was extremely important for yourself as a family, but also for communicating with others within the Jewish community.
Here's a question for you. In terms of the research, you talk a lot about going through the different kinds of archives, going through police reports and sort of the real granular level of policing on a day-to-day basis. Did you also look at resistance within the arts? There's somebody that wrote in whose mom was a Holocaust survivor and thinking about theater resistance in ghettos and camps as well as DP camps.
Yeah, I mean, art is always some kind of resistance, especially in oppressive regimes. So I didn't look specifically into this, but there's no question about it that art is resistance. We know this also from other regimes like art under apartheid in South Africa. So art is always a tool to, and especially, I mean, this reminds me of East Germany, when you don't have political means, like, for example, writing articles in newspapers because you don't have access to them, to write a short story can actually be the same, can have the same impact as writing an article in a newspaper. And a lot of the, let's say, fiction which was written, for example, in these regimes, were also using coded language for with critique of the regime. So I think it's very important, the writing, but also, let's say, other forms of art like photographs or film or paintings.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And just maybe like two more questions. One, I'm thinking a lot about, we're using the term perpetrator. We often focus on victims, we focus on survivors, and then there's also the discussion around bystanders and upstanders. Where do you think this kind of new research about individual acts of resistance and people and Jewish people's agency fits within that continuum?
Yeah, I think this is, in a way, makes it harder to talk about victims, because with victims immediately suggest people are passive, something happens to them. And I think what I try to do in the book is really to let reserve the agency of individuals. And for all kind of parts of the Jewish population, from young to old, men and women, and so even teenagers, right? So I think that's really important here.
And I guess my last question to you is, you talk about growing up in East Germany. What are some of your insights now for us as we approach these incredibly politically perilous times? What is some insights that you have from growing up under that experience?
So while I focused in the book on individual resistance, it seems to suggest a little bit that these people acted like alone, right? So for example, Benno Neuberger really did act alone because he didn't even inform his wife about the postcards. But in other cases, actually, people talked about what they did or wanted to do. And then in the end, even if they never told anybody about it, you are not alone because you have family, you have neighbors, you have friends, you are in relationships. And these relationships are extremely important because they create the conditions that you can actually commit these kind of individual resistance act. And so to strengthen relationships, to mobilize resources, that's I think is so important for this type of protest or resistance.
That is a beautiful way to end. And thinking about community, you have been one of those people for me in my community and have really kind of shown the way and been a mentor and really kind of a guiding light as we go through these incredibly difficult times. I feel like I'm not saying it to the degree that it is, but I want to thank you for being and joining the Kupferberg Holocaust Center tonight. To everyone who joined us and tuned in, we appreciate all of your support, and we look forward to seeing you at our next program. We hope you stay safe, and in those of you in places where it's frigid, you stay warm, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.